My name is Treva Lindsay. I'm a professor here in Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and it is both my pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend as our speaker for our annual colloquium. I struggle with that word for some reason. So I'm very excited to introduce him. C. Riley Snorton is a professor of English Language and Literature and Department and the Center for Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Chicago. Snorton is a cultural theorist who analyzes representations of race and gender throughout history. He is the author of Nobody is Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low from 2014, and the award-winning Black on Both Sides, A Racial History of Trans Identity, 2017, which won the Lambda Literary Award for Transgender Nonfiction and an American Library Association Nonfiction, and an American Library Association Stonewall Honor Book for Nonfiction. The book has also been recognized by the Organization of American Historians as well as the Institute for Humanities Research. Snorton's next monograph, tentatively titled Mud, Ecologies of Racial Meaning, examines the constitutive presence of swamps to racial practices and formations in the Americas. Currently, he is co-editing Saturation, Racial Matter, Institutional Limits, and the Excesses of Representation, and another text, because that wasn't enough, of this called The Flesh of the Matter, a Hortense Spillers reader. He's also co-edited several special issues in journals, including Blackness for Transgender Studies Quarterly, The Queerness of Hip Hop, The Hip Hop of Queerness, and Media Reform for the International Journal of Communication. Snorton has been the recipient of a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship at the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, an Andrew Mellon Postdoctoral Fellowship at Pomona College, and 2 fellowships at Harvard's W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for African and African American Research. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communication with graduate certificates in Africana Studies and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Title of the talk today, Black on Both Sides, Racial History of Trans Identity. Riley.
Generous introduction. I'm always quite embarrassed when I'm introduced, but it is such an honor to hear such kind words from a dear friend and colleague. And also, thank you to everyone coming out on an afternoon, Friday afternoon. I hope that the conversation we have here does not make you wish that you had spent this relatively warm day differently. So the talk that I prepared is really actually kind of a way through the various projects that I am working on, and I'm actually going to talk toward the end a little bit about the Mud Project and where it comes from in Black on Both Sides. And I am going to sort of give you a sense of how I've entered into a set of conversations, and I look forward to the conversation that will ensue after the talk. So my research explores, and also let me know if there's any issue if I need to like go back to my theater training from yesteryear and project for folks. So feel free to do something like this if you're in the back and having problems, okay? All right, so my research explores the relations between and among the signs, Black, queer, and trans, historically and contemporarily. And I employ Black feminist theory, literary criticism, performance studies, disability studies, media studies, among other fields of inquiry to address how race/sex/gender undergirds and articulates ways of being and knowing. My first book, Nobody's Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low, traces the emergence and circulation of the down low, a term which typically refers to Black men who have sex with men and women and do not identify as gay, bisexual, or queer in news and popular culture at the turn of the 21st century. The book reads down low discourses for the relations they produce in the world and offers 2 concepts, the glass closet and ignorance, to make sense of the production and circulation of a figure that is both omnipresent and unidentifiable. I argue that down low discourses perform a biopolitical function. attenuating and rationalizing surveillance as the supposed cure to the mediatized crisis and panic precipitated by increased rates of human immunodeficiency virus infection and acquired immune deficiency syndrome, also known by their acronyms HIV/AIDS, and particularly among Black women in the US. So while the glass closet first appears in academic discourse in Eve Sedgwick's Epistemology of the Closet, I rethink the concept in Nobody's Supposed to Know to examine the interplay of forces of racialization and queer and trans representational practices. I argue that the glass closet as a metaphor and an analytic enables an understanding of the down low and Black sexuality more generally as subject to spectacle and speculation, hypervisibility, and confinement. My book also attends to how ignorance as a tactic of refusal addresses how down low figures negotiate a biopolitical will to know, often through performances of not knowing. The final chapter on the frequent attachment of trans and queer rumors to Black celebrity served as a launching pad for some of the questions raised in the second book. So while the first book thinks through how speculation inflects representational practices of Black gender and sexuality, Black on both sides, extends that analysis and a consideration of the transitivities and transversalities of Blackness and transness, by which I mean the mutually constitutive and collateral genealogies between the signs Black and trans, primarily in the US and across the 19th and 20th century. Black on Both Sides takes as its archive an eclectic collection of materials, including late 19th century sexological texts, plantation medical records, fugitive slave narratives, Afro-modernist literary productions, documentary films, and mid-20th century journalistic accounts of Black trans people to demonstrate how race figures prominently in the development of the category of transgender. In viewing the interplay of Blackness and transness as transitive, which in the grammatical sense refers to an expression of action that requires a direct object to complete its sense of meaning, but also as it refers to the quality of passing into another condition, changeable, changeful, passing away, transient, transitory. The study begins by tracing the circulation of Black and trans as associated signs as they are brought into the same frame by the various ways they have been constituted as fungible, which is to say thingified and interchangeable within the logics of transatlantic exchange. As the first two chapters explore in greater depth, the fungibility of chattel persons produced a critical context for conceptualizing transness, generating understandings of sex and gender as subject to revision in the arenas of medicine and law. In the third chapter, reading the trans and transatlantic literature on the female within the three Negro classics, I bring Spiller's noted essay, Hortense Spiller's noted essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book, to bear on Booker T. Washington's Up From Slavery, W.E.B. Du Bois's The Soul of Black Folk, and James Weldon Johnson's Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. The patriarchal impulses that would structure a desire to be modern as a tenet of manhood rights necessitated a symbolic rearrangement of Black women's figurations, and through this process, Black modernity would indicate the ways Black gender is, in the words of Christina Sharp, anagrammatical, which is to say, open to rearrangement. So as the first two chapters take up fungibility to express how Black women, in particular, have been instrumentalized to create understandings of being and non-being in the arenas of science and law, this chapter explores how Black manhood would articulate itself around a symbolic order established through and upon Black female flesh ungendered. The association between being Black and having a Black mother was critical to maintaining the biopolitical ordering of slavery and continued as a question for consideration and redefinition through and in the wake of Reconstruction. In light of this interrelation, one could rearticulate the problem of the color line in terms of reproduction, such that one substitutes the question of what it feels to be a problem with what it means to have a Black mother. This metonymic move, which is also a play on how the logics of synecdoche and substitution structure the racial real in Afro-modernist literature, organizes the third chapter along a series of routes into the female within. So chapters 1 through 3 enact an argument about how transness animates blackness, figuring one part of a doubly negated relation, as it bears upon the articulation and experience of black life. In chapters 4 and 5, I attend to the other part of this negated relation in an exploration of the ways blackness animates transness, particularly as it pertains to the project of 20th century trans historiography, in my discussions of Christine Jorgensen, often called America's first transsexual celebrity, and Brandon Tina, who has been dubbed by some to be the nation's first trans martyr. Now, my talk today is actually drawn from the first 2 chapters of Black on Both Sides and focuses on concepts such as fungibility and flesh in the production of plantation medicine and antebellum law. It is framed by 2 quotes from Hortense Spillers, from Hortense Spillers' noted essay, Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, and the first on the unethical uses of flesh, and the second, which we'll see later, describes how flesh functions as a site of political and cultural maneuver. Flesh figures one route into the proverbial question on how matter matters. The aim here in juxtaposing 2 narratives about flesh is to demonstrate how a consideration of racialized gender reorients understandings of biological sex, and to take seriously how the fungibility of gender under captivity could become a condition of possibility for fugitive action in the mid-19th century. As I teased earlier, I'll conclude by talking briefly about how this project relates to my next book-length manuscript on swamps. So, to begin with this guiding quote, "The profitable atomizing of the captive body provides another angle on the divided flesh. We lose any hint or suggestion of a dimension of ethics, of relatedness between human personality and its anatomical features, between one human personality and another, between human personality and cultural institutions. To that extent, the procedures adopted for the captive flesh demarcate a total objectification, as the entire captive community becomes a living laboratory." On November 18, 1857, before an audience of the New York Academy of Medicine at the newly erected New York Historical Society building on 2nd Avenue and 11th Street, James Marion Sims delivered a speech on the importance of silver sutures in surgery. So I'm feeling, oh, nope. Great, now I know. I don't have the preview of what my next slide will be, so I bear with me for that. Thank you. Okay, all right. In his address to fellow physicians, Sims focused primarily on the 3.5 years of experiments performed on chattel women named Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, as well as several unnamed captives, which led to his career-making cure for vesicovaginal fistula, VVF. Sims described this genital malady by making reference to a verse from the book of Genesis, quote, "In sorrow and suffering shalt thou bring forth children." The full verse contains the complete judgment God meted out on the nameless woman who would later be called Eve, which in addition to an intensification of pain associated with childbirth, included a further imposition. Quote, "Thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee." So whereas Adam would be rendered mortal according to the parable of the fall of man, Eve was, according to literal interpretation, conscripted to submission. Sims's inclusion of this biblical citation provides a key for reading his medical corpus. On the one hand, his work signals how suffering and dominion transitively articulated the formation of gynecology. On the other, Sims's archive and the narratives of the named and unnamed experimentees indicate a transversal link between the metaphysical and the material, given expression in and as flesh. In the same speech, Sims described the experiments as part of a mission, which he imagined was, if not of a divine character, at least of divine origin. His repeated invocations of God did more than intimate how Sims was a man of faith. They constructed a grammar for methodological, and here we might read medical and scientific, evaluation, by way of a theopolitical justification for mechanisms of pain and control. This unethical grammar of suffering would dominantly express how Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and the unnamed others would function as a living laboratory within a political economy wherein their atomized flesh took on an adjunctive function in the production and reproduction of a series of instruments and procedures, all given the name Sims. A vesicovaginal fistula is a breach in the vaginal wall that opens into the urinary tract and produces continuous involuntary discharge of urine. As L.L. Wall explains, VVFs are the result of a massive crush injury to the soft tissue of the pelvis. According to Dorinda Ojinaga, chattel persons were particularly at risk for VVF because of, quote, poor nutrition, lack of prenatal care, and births at an early age. Yet the pelvis was also a critical site for producing racial hierarchies among 19th century anatomists and sexologists intent on finding bodily proof of Black inferiority. Sandra Gilman explains that the pelvis in racial science acted in an intermediary role as both secondary and primary sexual sign in theories of species differentiation. In addition, and as another indication of how physicians viewed cases of VVF among chattel persons as the supposed evidence of racial inferiority, occurrences of VVF were frequently attributed to the ignorance of midwives of their own color. So though Sims would recursively euphemize this condition as an accident, vesicovaginal fistula functioned as a sign of slavery, as signifier and signified in a chain of meaning to give expression to what Saidiya Hartman describes as, quote, the erasure or disavowal of sexual violence that engendered Black femaleness as a condition of unredressed injury. Sims's archives here serve, to quote Spillers, as a materialized scene of female flesh ungendered. His more than 3 years of experiments on named and unnamed chattel persons for the treatment of VVF served as proof of Black females' genital exceptionalism as non-reproductive, inverted, unfeminine, even as the procedures also produced an erasure of chattel slavery's effect on Black female genitalia in the state of exception. The international acclaim Sims received for his treatment of VVF generates a number of questions about the transubstantiation of things as it relates to the life of flesh that resides in the series of instruments and procedures, including Sims's speculum, catheter, and sutures, and also in terms of what VVF and its cure reveal about the relationship between sex as a biological category and ungendered flesh. So in the full chapter, I describe how Sims comes to possess Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, and the unnamed captives, the brutality of his experiments, and the broader geopolitical context of an impending civil war, underscoring how fungibility served as an animating logic in this macabre moment in medical history. However, for the purposes of this talk, I want to move directly to his first article on VVF, which he described as, quote, his last free will offering to the medical profession, and issued in the American Journal of Medical Sciences in January 1852. The essay title, On the Treatment of Vesicovaginal Fistula, made claim to 3 original and proprietary contributions to medical knowledge. Quote, the discovery of a method by which the vagina can be thoroughly explored and operations easily performed. The second, the introduction of a new suture apparatus. And third, the invention of a self-retaining catheter. Unlike his previous essays, which included at least a brief description of his patients, this article is symptomatically devoid of any identifying characteristics of Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, or the unnamed others. Sims does include that at the first, I had 3 cases upon which I operated about 40 times, but failed in every instance to effect a perfect cure, though succeeding so far as to encourage me to persevere. Now, as a pronouncement that bespeaks a set of subject-object relations, Sims's discussion of personal triumph, determination, and curiosity, qualities that would afford his status in the field of gynecology, works in tandem with the suppression of the conditions in which his knowledge was procured. the focus on proprietary instruments and procedures, and the oblique references to his patients, who are also invoked in terms of, quote, the particularities of individual cases, finds visual reinforcement in the series of 22 woodcuts printed from diagrams Sims drew himself that organize the essay's prose. As object lessons, the accompanying images provide a way to understand flesh as an expression of power's polyvalent mobilities, a la Foucault. Here, there are no bodies except tacitly Sims, because his patients were nobodies according to the precepts of law and medicine. The first set of illustration depicts two instruments. One is sparsely outlined, which Sims describes as, quote, a small, slightly convex spatula designed to supplement the figure on its left, which would later be referred to as Sims's speculum. Here I'm referring to the upper, what would be your upper left, that upper window. Of Latin origin, speculum roughly translates as a tool, ulum, for looking, specere, and refers to a surgical instrument used for dilating orifices or as a mirror used for scientific purpose. Embellished with texture, Sims's speculum, although composed from German silver, appears to be hewn from the wood from which these images were made. Analogously to contemporaneous printmaking practices, Sims suggests that the speculum should be reproduced with 2 or 3 different sizes so as to be prepared for any case. Each letter printed along the perimeter of the drawing corresponds to an instruction about the instrument's design. The lettering not only maps the spatial coordinates of the speculum, but also presents a topological relation between Sims's instrument and the instrumentality of flesh and its capacity for expansion and inspection. It is perhaps unsurprising that an object that expressed the directive to look would perform an instrumental role in the narrative emergence of gynecology in the U.S. Investments in the visual and the making of racial slavery meant organizing life according to who was doing the seeing and who or what was being overseen. In addition, the field of gynecology was developed according to a Manichaean logic, what Maria Lugones refers to as the dark and light side of the colonial modern gender system, which as, and this is to quote Lugones here, which as a cognitive production of modernity understood race as gendered and gender as raced in particularly differential ways for Europeans/whites and colonized/non-white people. Syl Harris, Sims's biographer, narrates gynecology's emergence in similar terms, suggesting that in the field of women's diseases, physicians were blind men working in the dark. He continues in a description of a different image, emblematic of the period, of gynecological illustration. Quote, just how much in the dark they were is revealed by 19th century woodcuts portraying physicians examining their female patients. A picture of a lady on her medical advisor's table shows the patient not only fully clothed, but with hat and gloves thrown in for good measure, while over her rear, from waist to feet, is draped a sheet, beneath which the unseeing physician extends his groping hands, struggling manfully to solve the mystery of her ailments. So more than anecdotal, right, this passage exemplifies the instantiating rhetoric of gynecology, in which the coupling of sex and gender occur as a racial arrangement. The reference to the double bind of blindness while working in the dark that characterized the field at its genesis seems to figure the other side of Du Bois's double consciousness, in which the visualizing rhetoric of race, a la the veil, transverses gender's constitution beneath the sheet. Here, Harris's description illustrates how, on the one hand, white femininity is conferred in relation to an unwillingness to view white female genitalia. That is, to look upon white women as flesh. On the other hand, the unrelenting scopic availability that defined blackness within the visual economy of racial slavery becomes the necessary context for producing a field of sex/gender knowledge. From this vantage point, one could consider the various ways gender functions as an effect of plantation visuality, wherein captive flesh expressed an ungendered position that defines race as the substance of sex. In this arrangement, gender socially constructs sex, and captive flesh becomes the material and metaphorical ground for unsettling a view of sex and gender as neatly divided according to each term's relation to medico-scientific knowledge. Elaine Scarry notes how the concept of body and voice, or in the language of Christian scriptures, flesh and word, emerge as explanatory rubrics in early moments of creating, or when there is some problem in the relation between maker and made thing that carries us back to the original moment of making. Supposing that the problem is an ethical one, the woodcut images of Sims's inventions in On the Treatment of Vesicovaginal Fistula, although not directly indicating chattel slavery as a necessary condition for VVF's cure, indicate how gynecology materialized a series of subject-object relationships according to what Foucault describes as a type of power that can only function through the formation of a knowledge that is both its effect and also a condition of its exercise. The erect form of the instruments in the article's accompanying illustrations, pictured as if they were sitting for a portrait, function as another sign of the total objectification that produced subjectified objects of flesh. As representations of flesh, the images figure flesh as blackness in abstraction, desubjectified and material, the substance of method and mode. As such, the woodcuts serve as illustrations of the instrumentality of flesh as a first order of instrumentation, and of the creation of additional instruments of and for flesh. However, the instrumentality of flesh was never fully subsumed by the logics of racial slavery. As the second part of my talk bears out, fungible flesh also became a site for fugitive maneuver. Published in 1861 under the titles Linda, or Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl and Incidents of a Life of a Slave Girl written by herself, the text at the titular level reflects the interanimating antagonisms between the subject, object, and voice of its author, Harriet Jacobs, its narrator and protagonist, Linda Brent, and its editor, Lydia Maria Child. As scholars have noted, Jacobs began to conceptualize her story in book form as early as 1851 or 1852. After an unfruitful attempt to secure Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of a best-selling novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, as her amanuensis, Jacobs began writing her book on her own. Having completed the manuscript in 1858, after at least 2 publishers expressed interest only to go bankrupt before releasing the text in print, Jacobs ultimately paid to have the book privately printed in early 1861. Initially conceived to address an audience of Northern white women, the narrative takes a cross-genre form, having been described as a fugitive narrative that includes elements of sentimental, Gothic, and anti-slavery novel forms that carry particular racial and gender significance for its various audiences, including critics, given that it was the first text of its kind to be published by a Black woman in the United States. Valerie Smith notes how incidents contravene the plot of the standard fugitive narrative, which according to convention up until that point traced, and this is Smith's words here, not only the journey from slavery to freedom, but also the journey from slavehood to manhood. Partially through his manipulation of form, Jacobs' narrative, according to Hazel Carby, also revealed the concept of true womanhood to be an ideology, not a lived set of social relations. Incident is rife with intertextual signs, offering numerous metaphors, allegories, and incidents that speak both to the conditions of Brent's fugitive passage and the context of Jacobs' narrative production. Brent's dramatic escape maps a different terrain of ungendered blackness that simultaneously marks the intersection and mutual envelopment of fugitivity and fungibility. Narrative portrayals of the protagonist's sexual negotiations clarify aspects of Brent Jacobs' ungendering. Hartman has described how incidence underlines the, quote, unwieldiness of sexuality, the entanglements of instrumentality and pleasure, expressed by a chattel person, constituted by an indifference to injury, the extended use and dispossession of the captive body, the negation of motherhood, and the failures and omissions of the law. These elements or incidents, as Hartman explains, determine the condition of enslavement and engenderment. And Spillers also suggests that though this is barely hinted on the surface of the text, we might say that Brent, between the lines of narrative, demarcates a sexuality that is neuter-bound, inasmuch as it represents an open vulnerability to a gigantic sexualized repertoire that may be alternately expressed as male/female. So in the delineation of the various ways captivity coercively decouples bodily comportment from the dominant symbolics of gender and sexuality and incidence, Brent Jacobs' maneuver raises the question of what is sexuality to and for the fungible. As a partial response, Brent's, quote, deliberate calculation to bear children from Mr. Sands is an instance of the kinds of actions available under captivity. The narrator/protagonist relates, quote, it seems less degrading to give oneself than to submit to compulsion. There is something akin to freedom in having a lover who has no control over you, except that which he gains by kindness and attachment. The numerous circumscriptions and qualifications in Brent's description shed light on Jacobs' critique and exposition of the impossibility of normative gender and sexual reciprocity under captivity. Rather, gender and sexuality appear by way of their constitutive injury, such that, as Aliyah Abdur-Rahman argues, Jacobs' narrative highlights how incidents of abuse serve as both metonym and metaphor for the lived experience of American slavery. Though Brent determines a sexual relationship with Sands to be less degrading than compulsory concubinage to her enslaver Dr. Flint, that calculation, as some critics have argued, came with little measure for protection. Sands' decision to make their black daughter the personal slave of his wife, and Brent's concern over her daughter's imminent life in captivity, catalyzed Brent Jacobs' conscripted movement, inaugurating the narrative action of the fugitive drama of incidents. The choreography of Brent Jacobs' escape begins as it ends, with the protagonist finding harbor in the home of a sympathetic white woman, and this is Jacobs' terms. The circumstances of her earliest hiding place foreshadow the garret that she later labels a loophole of retreat, a space of freedom that is at the same time a space of captivity. Brent's dependence on the unnamed white woman also prefigures the vexed form of freedom the protagonist experiences as a servant in the North. The recurring theme of finding spaces for maneuvering within confinement aptly describes, as Christina Sharp has suggested, that Brent Jacobs' condition as fugitive, abolitionist, and author in terms of being still protected and unprotected in her relationships with whites. Before her temporary concealment within the white mistress's storeroom, Brent Jacobs describes having been bitten by a reptile of some kind, a detail in the narrative that not only explains some of the perils of fugitivity, but also foreshadows the protagonist's various encounters with the snaky swamp. The recurrence of the swamp as yet another site of temporary refuge for the protagonist amplifies her narrative's elucidation of freedom in terms of the vexed spaces of ongoing fugitivity that emerge, however briefly, from within more general conditions of unfreedom and constraint. Just as the loophole refers to both the small space in Brent Jacobs' grandmother's attic and contains the protagonist for 7 years, and the hole that Brent makes in that space in order to see outside, the swamp stages the transversal relationship between fugitive life and death, as it also allegorizes how fungibility emerges as a tactic of maneuvering from within the morass of slavery's identity politics. To and from the snaky swamp, Brent moves in disguise, and in these cross-dressed perambulations enacts a fugitive plot that stages through Brent's ungendered body the various ways fungibility and fugitivity pass into one another. that crossing in form, narrative, and flesh condenses the text narration of the conditions of captive life, as it provides a way to interpret Britt Jacobs' numerous calculations and incidents in terms of fungible fugitivity. In the chapter New Perils, readers learn how Betty, the enslaved cook and servant of the sympathetic white woman, brings Brent, quote, a suit of sailor's clothes, jacket, trousers, and tarpaulin hat. Donning her disguise, Brent passes through town twice, describing her return trip in this way. Quote, I wore my sailor's clothes and had blackened my face with charcoal. I passed several people whom I knew. The father of my children came so near that I brushed against his arm, but he had no idea who it was. Jacob's use of the transitive verb pass to describe moving through space also portends the intransitive sense of the term, as the scene renders the mechanisms by which gender and racial subversion are assumed. This intransitive passing, as the performance of false identity, reached its peak of usage in print in the mid to late 1800s, coinciding with the initial publication of Jacob's fugitive narrative, though its particular meaning had emerged in the mid-15th century during the first wave of European colonization. Many of the accounts of cross-gendered escape explicitly articulated themselves as passing narratives, particularly in the case of the Crafts, who from the printed iteration of their story in 1849 are referred to as a pair of passing figures, one passing as a disabled white gentleman, the other as his servant. As Jacob's scene relates, for fugitive movement, Brent completes her attire of sailor's clothes by blackening her face. Jasmine Cobb suggests that this blackening may have been an anticipatory gesture. When James Norcombe, Jacob's enslaver, published a description of her in the 1835 issue of the American Beacon, he presumed that she would be seeking whiteness and dressing as a free woman, not accentuating her blackness, and finding a cross-dressing and ungendered mode for escape. Although the description of sartorial arrangement seems to conform to passing logic of movement for protection or privilege, Jacob's use of charcoal to darken her complexion tropes, by inverse logic, on more commonly held beliefs and fears about racial passing. As passing became a term to describe performing something one is not, it trafficked a way of thinking about identity not only in terms of real versus artificial, but also, and perhaps always, as proximal and performative. Like a vertical line with arrows on either end, passing is figuratively represented by moving up or down hierarchized identificatory formations. This articulation of vertical identity also coordinates with forms of binary thinking, typified, for example, in the language of opposite sex. So as passing is most commonly understood, one ascends into privilege, being, and distinction, or as Jacob's blackening suggests, into the converse of those things, which is to say into fungibility, thingness, and the interchangeable. In this vertical model, blackness functions as the possibility of distinction, in which fungibility acts as the requisite grounds from which distinction is formed. Here, blackness is simultaneously a space for new forms of becoming. Britt Jacobs' blackened blackness gives expression to her condition as fungible within the logics of U.S. slavery, in which the system of colorism, as Nicole Fleetwood has argued, produces a performing subject whose function is to enact difference, an act that is fundamentally about assigning value. As it relates to the scene of Jacobs brushing past sands, her status as it also indicates how blackness as fungible engenders forms of non-recognition. As Jacob's performance elucidates how blackness and going blacker became an embrace of the conditions that might allow one to pass one's friends and lovers undetected. In this encounter, fungibility sets the stage for gendered maneuvers on a terrain constituted by modes of viewing blackness, in which Jacob's blackness and going blacker color her gender as well as her face. The ecological characteristics of the snaky swamp serve an allegorical function in illustrating how fungibility produced what Brent Jacobs describes as a hiding place for those in no situation to choose. While preparing herself to enter that fugitive space that articulated a simultaneous promise of life and death, Brent Jacobs tells the reader of how her previous snake bite and fear of snakes filled her with an especial dread. Narrating the encounter with the swamp in detail, Brent describes how the lush natural environment that concealed her and her companion also teemed with predatory and poisonous wildlife. Incidents portrays the swamp as a death space for human life, or more precisely, a space of near death into which some other quality of living is assumed out of necessity. Its perception as uninhabitable is what also constitutes the swamp as a loophole of retreat. Yet the protagonist also notes at the conclusion of her description how she prefers the terror of the swamp and its inhabitants over the forms of racial and gender terror exercised by white men in so-called civilization. Though Brent Jacobs has this direct experience of both, the passage elects the use of imagination to describe the differences between the two sites. This word choice elicits a reading of this passage in terms of its referentiality to an abolitionist literary and public imaginary. As Anne Bradford Warner describes, the snaky swamp is on one level an intertextual parody of Stowe's, referring here to Harriet Beecher Stowe's, recurrent depiction of Black fugitive life set within a romanticized backdrop of the swamps, and particularly pronounced in Stowe's characterization of the dismal swamp in the 1857 novel Dread. John J. Kusich has additionally argued that the African spiritualist symbolism in Jacobs' representation of the snaky swamp functions as a mode of literary or textual concealment, rendering the swamp in ways that remain irreducible to European American norms. Yet, here, as with Flesh, the swamp is both material and metaphysical. If you go to Edenton, North Carolina's website, they offer this self-guided walking tour, and as you'll see, they gesture to the snaky swamp here as off the page, right? But I suppose it's an invitation to go there. So in addition to being a polyvalent literary device, the snaky swamp is a real place. Located west of Edenton, North Carolina, it bears a geographical proximity to the Great Dismal Swamp, a site for the longer durational inhabitation of marooned Africans and Native people that conveys how its ecological features produced an adversarial terrain for human life, rife with the imminent and ever-present difficulties of cohabitation with its non-human animal inhabitants for the displaced and dispossessed. Incidence returns to the idea of the snaky swamp in a brief exchange between Brent and the sea captain who eventually transported her to Philadelphia. Quote, "As we passed the snaky swamp, he pointed to it and said, 'There is a slave territory that defies all the laws.' I thought of the terrible days I had spent there and thought it was not called and though it was not called Dismal Swamp, it made me feel very dismal as I looked at it." The captain's characterization of the snaky swamp as defiant of all laws bespeaks what Sylvia Wynter describes as the development of a new worldview, a system of ordering logics that accompanied the discovery of the Americas that were expressed according to a series of binary oppositions, including master and natural slave, rational and irrational, and habitable and uninhabitable territories. As Catherine McKittrick relates, post-1492, what the uninhabitable tells us is that populations who occupy the non-existent are living in what has been previously conceptualized as unlivable and unimaginable. If identity and place are mutually constructed, the uninhabitable spatializes a human other category of the unimaginable, native, Black. The captain's pronouncement also invokes the swampland's transversal histories of marronage with a more dogmatic and theological sense of slavery. Whether for 2 days as an incident or 10 generations, as Daniel Sawyers contends in his research on the archaeological remains of the Great Dismal Swamp, the region's inhabitation by marooned beings is figured and transversed according to a settler colonial subjective understanding of the swamps as sites of terror and lawlessness beyond the parameters of God's grace. It is a landscape that slavery produces and reiteratively capacitates as a viable option, or more precisely, as the choice, non-choice, for those in no situation to choose between one form of mortality over another. In this sense, one encounters the seemingly paradoxical construction of fungible fugitivity and its relation to the swamp's material and metaphysical region of mortality. Gesturing toward a similar epistemic structure, the swamp expresses the conditions of the fugitive's experience of something akin to freedom, enabled by modes of apprehension, domination, and control, introduced and refined within the morass of plantation identitarian logics. In this sense, Brent's cross-gender foray to and from the snaky swamp is a redoubled articulation of the fugitive possibilities within and structured by the geographical and metaphysical architecture of slavery, a descent into the mud, a blackening of blackness, the mutability of a body defined as inexhaustibly interchangeable, an inhabitation of the virtually uninhabitable, being within the zone of non-being. The oft-quoted conclusion of incidents in which Brent tells her reader that my story ends with freedom, not in the usual way with marriage, includes a qualifying confession. The dream of my life is not yet realized. I do not sit with my children in a home of my own. This description of freedom, or something akin to it, punctuates the fungible fugitivity that incident stages, wherein blackness is that vestibularizing paradigm that is both within and outside the nation as home, and in which black people find no home but a loophole of retreat in life and within the symbolics of gender. So working on Jacobs has been key for developing questions for this next book-length manuscript. And by way of conclusion, I'll share just a few, really very few, thoughts about what's next. Tentatively entitled Mud, Ecologies of Racial Meaning, this project examines the constitutive presence of swamps to racial practices and formations in the Americas. Narratives about swamp people and swamp things punctuate stories of the New World, from the maroon communities constituted by formerly enslaved Africans and Native peoples beginning in the early 16th century, to the first Asians, Filipinos, to arrive in the U.S., who settled in swamps surrounding modern-day New Orleans in 1763. Mud is archival. Okay, this is where I shared with you my dream for what this will be, right? Okay. So Mud is archival and archaeological, exploratory and experimental, interdisciplinary and mixed methodological, and draws on poetry by Carl Phillips and Lyra van Cleef-Stefanen, the works of contemporary artists such as Alison Saar, Candace Lynn, and Kai Barrow, original field research and archival materials. This project contributes to and extends feminist and trans scholarship on the environment, research on race and ecology, including ecological disaster, to address how matter and meaning are made and remediated in the swamps. The swamp becomes a rubric for reading how freedom is neither abstracted nor wholly performative, but an exercise that works in and on the body. That praxis that Jacobs describes as choice when in no situation to choose. So as a place that's neither land nor water but both, the swamp functions as the material ground for my next project and for a series of ongoing considerations about ontological transformation, life and death, freedom, and choice. Thank you so much.